So welcome to all of our cities who are joining us today. What an array of wonderful representation from around the country. And a special shout out and thank you to our program partner, the U.S. Conference of Mayors. My name is Rose Gill, and I'm the principal of Bloomberg Associates Municipal Integrity Practice. And just a couple of what you've heard already. If you could keep yourselves on mute throughout the program, we would greatly appreciate it. Kindly put questions into the chat throughout the program, and we'll invite anybody to come on camera with their question as well as we go along. And this is a 90-minute program, and that's because of the number of funding opportunities that are being covered, so that we hope that you can stay with us for the duration. But not to worry, the program is being video recorded, and it, along with all the materials and the slides, will be available on our website following the program. So if you miss anything, that's where you can go. This workshop is part of our Bloomberg U.S. Conference of Mayors Federal Assistance E311 program. To date, the E311 program has provided almost 4,800 city practitioners in over 1,100 cities with information about the complexities of federal funding, eligibility, requirements, record keeping. We've been helping cities navigate the complexities of federal funding streams since March of 2020, beginning with FEMA funding and then the CARES Act. We evolved when the ARPA funding became available, and now our program has expanded again, encompassing the IIJA infrastructure funding. We are provided that guidance through workshops like this one that are designed to provide the latest information about funding opportunities and regulations. The other feature of the E311 program is that it provides one-on-one technical guidance from our emergency management subject matter expert partners who have answered over 350 questions this year for cities around the country about federal funding. One of those partners is Hagerty Consulting, and they will be presenting on today's panel. Moderating our program today is my colleague, Adam Freed, who runs the sustainability practice at Bloomberg Associates. Adam is also previously served as director of New York City's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. He currently serves on the New York City Water Board and teaches sustainability at Columbia. So I will turn it over to Adam with no further ado to introduce the panel.
Thank you so much, Rose, and I'm very excited to welcome all of you here today to our E311 workshop to talk about how to leverage federal funding for hazard mitigation and resilience. The past year has demonstrated the tremendous stress cities are under in responding to and preparing for extreme events, above and beyond those posed by a global pandemic. Last year, more than a dozen cities set new temperature records, spanning Boston, Toledo, Bismarck, North Dakota, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And these single-day records don't tell the full story of heat waves and rising temperatures that many cities are grappling with, as Phoenix, Arizona had over 130 days with triple-digit temperatures last year. 2021 also saw 21 named storms in the Atlantic, including Hurricane Ida, which killed 13 people in my home of New York City. And despite periods of heavy rainfall that can have a devastating impact, we're in the midst of a historic drought in the West, the worst that we've seen in more than 1,200 years, with 95% of the region facing some form of an abnormally dry or drought conditions. And these drought conditions and record-breaking heat waves spurred wildfires across the U.S. that burned more than 7 million acres of land last year. These risks are real, and they're significant, and they're only going to become more extreme. And as all of us on this call know, cities are on the front lines of preparation, response, and recovery when disaster strikes. In response to the increase in the number and scale of extreme events, the federal government has increased funding for several critical programs to help state and local governments respond to these risks. And several new funding streams and programs were included in ARPA and the IIJA to support local hazard mitigation and resilience efforts. In today's conversation, we'll talk about programs that represent more than $130 billion in funding available in the next year, including 7 new programs in the IIJA with over $3.5 billion in funding that can be leveraged for cities. In addition to the PowerPoint and recording of these sessions, which will be emailed to you after the session is concluded, we'll also send you an overview of 16 different programs that we're going to talk about with detailed information on the funding opportunities, how to access them, and who's eligible. But while we're here, as Rose said, please keep the chat active and send us your questions. We're going to have plenty of opportunities at the end of the program and within the program to answer your questions and directly engage with the experts who are on the line. And we very much want this to be an interactive session. With that, I'm absolutely thrilled to hand it over to John Hageman at Haggerty Consulting, which, as Rose said, helps clients prepare for and respond to and recover from disasters, and has been one of our early expert partners participating in the E301 program. And I'm also very excited to welcome representatives from my home city and former colleagues who I worked with when I was in city government from New York City. We're going to talk about and give a real life example of how they navigated and leveraged federal funding for their resilience work. With that, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Adam, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Hageman. I oversee Haggerty's federal funds management offering, as Adam said, really helping governments prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters, and helping cities identify, secure, and manage federal funding. I'm joined today by several of my colleagues, Harrison Newton, Vanessa Castillo, and Tom Leatherby, all of which are former city officials with expertise in mitigation and resilience. As Adam said, we're also joined by our partner, Heather Roter and Neg LeCue from New York City, the New York City Emergency Management Agency, as well as the New York City Department of Transportation. Before I turn it over to Harrison, you can go to the next slide, Kenna, just run through the agenda for today. We're going to start with really framing the conversation and talk a bit about planning, resilience and mitigation planning, and how cities can go about organizing and developing a comprehensive strategy and plan to take advantage of the unprecedented amounts of federal dollars available. We'll then dive into the FEMA hazard mitigation programs, followed by a case study from our partners with New York City. At that time, we'll have a period for initial questions to get folks' feedback and questions on the FEMA hazard mitigation programs in particular. We'll then pivot to other mitigation and resilience programs. As Adam said, there's several programs throughout the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and we'll talk a bit about those programs as well before going through a fund mapping exercise that will really bring to life how cities can navigate all of the various federal funding opportunities in the event of a disaster and really take advantage of the unprecedented amounts of money. After that, we'll have an extensive question and answer session where folks will be able to participate and engage with both us as well as our partners from New York City and have time to answer questions. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Harrison Newton, who will take us through resilience and mitigation planning and really set the framework for what's to come moving forward.
Thank you, John. I couldn't be more pleased to be here with you and the cities on the line. So it's not an overstatement to say that the Infrastructure Investment Act, Jobs Act, and the associated opportunities will provide a once-in-a-generation opportunity. An extraordinary level of resources are going to be available for a broad array of projects for cities of all sizes. While over $280 billion are going to go toward transportation-related projects, there are billions of dollars available for power and grid, heat, fire, water, resiliency, mitigation for infrastructure threatened by coastal hazards, mitigation writ large. Within these programs that you see here, there are going to be opportunities not only for implementation, but the kind of planning needed to pull off complicated infrastructure improvements. And as you know, those are some of the hardest dollars to come by. So while we hope to provide a breakdown of these opportunities that are tied to these funding streams, we also want to provide our thinking on the tremendous opportunity for city leaders to accomplish or advance key objectives for their communities. The projects that will be supported by these programs are the kind that can transform city infrastructure, revitalize neighborhoods, better connect them to commerce and new assets, and protect neighborhoods from risk. So over the next 5 years, projects and plans that might not have been possible in this new ecosystem will be. And that's obviously hugely exciting. So as we've looked at moments like this in the past, ARPA, CARES, cities that are ready with a strategic approach are often able to pull in more dollars and use them more beneficially than those who can compete for and use dollars in silos. So really now is a great moment, I think, at once to understand and try to understand the programs that you see, but also to take the moment to elevate and really consider what is this moment going to mean for your city? What are the objectives and priorities that you're going to be able to achieve now that the resources have so vastly increased? So we've also, one last note on this, we've also broken out these opportunities in a handout that you'll receive at the conclusion of the presentation. Great. So to spend a moment to think about what are the really critical elements that your city is going to have to think about, developing more capacity in. Compliance and reporting, of course, rises to the top. How are you going to think about securing and managing these funds? The securing part is key. Some of these applications are going to be highly technical. They're going to rely on assessments and work that your city has done in the past. Others might require new work or industry for your agencies to engage in order to create these applications. So really the process of being able to secure these funds, identifying what's advantageous for your particular environment, and pulling together the right team to go after it is going to be key. And then the management piece, of course, all of these different funding streams have compliance elements, and they're rigorous. So we've seen a lot of success from cities that were small, cities mid-size, rural and urban, who have either identified a chief officer at the executive level in the budget team to oversee funds and to be augmented with an office to deal with the tracking and reporting that's going on alongside actual implementation. We've also seen folks at the agency level deputized with authority to work with their peers to track funds. There are different models. Bloomberg has done a lot of looking at this, and there's an asset on this slide that we really recommend you look at as you begin to think about building the capacities to secure and manage these funds effectively. So again, elevating to think about what could this mean for your city, and I really look at this as a new resilience moment. This is a time where really a city can look at these funds and think comprehensively, not just about these as unique individual opportunities, but to really think big picture about the risks that your city faces. Those can be identified through new processes. A lot of you have done a lot of work in this space already. You've either through city plans, through agency plans, prior work, working with local universities, you've identified hazards and risks, whether they be heat, flood, et cetera. And so now really this is the time to pull that knowledge together. I certainly have to speak to the centrality of the hazard mitigation plan in this work, which many cities have developed as part of the FEMA-driven process, as the centerpiece for understanding risk in your environment and how you're going to mitigate and buy it down. But even if you don't have a hazard mitigation plan standing, there are other ways you may have already looked at risk in your environment. And actually, there are opportunities within these dollars to do risk assessment and to actually kind of create the new understanding of risk. So that's a huge piece there that I think cities are going to want to take advantage of. I like to really focus on the multi-agency planning process that can underscore and really support these efforts. Certainly, there are agencies in your environment that are tied to these funding streams or maybe familiar with some of these existing funding streams, but broadening the conversation and tying it to executive plans can always and only strengthen your application, and you may find opportunities to leverage resources. We've seen tremendous ingenuity in the past from cities of all sizes. We've seen a large city, secure federal dollars for which they had actually planned to use local dollars for a mitigation project, and then reallocate those dollars to support local neighborhoods, vulnerable neighborhoods, in better understanding their risks and participating in the process as stakeholders. So when you really do the comprehensive across the board planning process, you find interesting opportunities for equity and that is key. That we're, I think as this is a resilience moment, it's key to think about the neighborhoods where communities we're protecting being a part of this process. So I'll leave it there, and if you can go to the next slide. I'll hand it over to my colleague, Vanessa, to go through the hazard mitigation assistance piece.
Thank you, Harrison. I'm excited to provide our audience with more information on mitigation funding opportunities. During the next few slides, I will speak to the FEMA hazard mitigation programs, specifically the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, the Flood Mitigation Assistance, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Funding opportunities. What we show here are some of the key attributes of these 4 programs. All 4 are managed by FEMA, but administered by the states, meaning that the states act as gatekeepers. They set state funding priorities, give communities the green light to proceed with applications, provide technical assistance, and set state deadlines and application processes. The BRIC and FMA are nationally competitive programs with national priorities and competitive criteria. The successful BRIC projects from fiscal year 20 were high impact, whole community, and climate adaptive solutions. FMA projects must protect NFIP insured structures. And in particular, the program prioritizes projects with high rates of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures. In an effort to make FMA more innovative and responsive to community needs, FEMA released the Swift Current program this spring to get FMA dollars to communities and homeowners most in need faster. The initial tranche of Swift Current will go to Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program is the mitigation funding most folks are familiar with. This funding becomes available post-disaster to fund mitigation activities statewide, typically on undamaged assets. Last year, all states and territories received at least one major disaster declaration, COVID-19. President Biden approved $3.46 billion in HMGP. This funding source could potentially still be open in some states, so we recommend you contact your state hazard mitigation officer if you're interested in this opportunity. The deadlines for that funding are probably approaching soon. The most important note for the pre-disaster mitigation for PDM is that this program now consists of direct appropriations to individual projects by Congress. The 68 projects that were selected in FY22 were appropriated funds in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022. If your city is interested in these funds, we encourage you to contact your local or state legislative affairs office to get more information and advocate for your projects. Can the next slide, please? Thank you. The building blocks of hazard mitigation. These are essentially the fundamental tenets of the 4 programs I just introduced. First and foremost, you must be an eligible sub-applicant. This includes municipal jurisdictions like we have in the audience today. You must have or participate in a FEMA-approved local hazard mitigation plan, like Harrison mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. You can't begin construction or put a shovel in the ground before FEMA approves your grant award. Note that the barrier to entry is no longer having a shovel-ready project. We always encourage folks to phase projects that do not have advanced engineering or environmental studies. This gives you more flexibility in submitting projects that are not quite ready for construction. Many states require a notice of interest for all 4 programs. This gives them an opportunity to select the projects that are eligible, feasible, and cost-effective. Maybe those projects that are most competitive under the programs and are most aligned with state priorities. The proposed project or your proposed projects should really clearly show an increased level of protection to people, structures, and infrastructure to be eligible. The proposed project scope of work must be an independent mitigation solution. What this means is that the project is not dependent on other work to be effective. 2 key elements that are driving prioritization at the federal level, and for some states, especially in the last few years, are equity and climate adaptation techniques in project design and in project implementation. We'll talk about equity on the following slide a little bit more. Next slide, Kenna, please. Thank you. So what we're talking about here is equity. The federal government is really committing funds to programs and projects that have a direct benefit to disadvantaged communities. These are communities that have any combination of the variables listed here on the right-hand side. This includes high rates of low-income residents, historical racial segregation, communities that have been subject to disproportionate impacts from climate change and other key characteristics. As we mentioned here, through the Justice 40 initiative, 40% of BRIC and FMA funds in FY21 were to be invested in projects that directly benefited disadvantaged communities. FEMA embedded this prioritization in the competitive criteria for both BRIC and FMA. Of the 6 qualitative criteria for the BRIC program, 4 make direct mention of benefits to disadvantaged communities or the inclusion of these communities in project development. For example, the narrative should discuss how these communities are engaged through the planning process, how they are participating in project selection and design, what types of direct benefits do these communities gain from the mitigation activities. Enhancing equity is a key objective for these programs and something we expect to continue to see in the funding announcements for fiscal year 2022. We highly encourage you all, if you are considering the national competitive grants, to be mindful of this priority when identifying projects to submit for funding. We included 2 tools on this slide you can use to document the presence of disadvantaged communities in your project benefiting area. The CDC Social Vulnerability Index, which is what FEMA uses when evaluating FMA projects, and then the EPA Environmental Justice Screening Tool. You can use these tools to supplement your application materials. The key here, though, is to go beyond mapping exercises and truly engage these communities when designing mitigation projects and resiliency programs. This will make it easier to showcase this work and speak to your outreach in your funding application. Next slide. Now we move towards what to do with all of this information, how best to leverage the funding that's out there. Are the project ideas that you have, are they competitive for this funding? And does it make sense to apply? What we've done here is mapped out our recommendations for the funding source to pursue, given the characteristics of your project. If you're a city with strong building code enforcement and you're located in a state that has adopted statewide building codes aligned with the most recent international building codes, your proposed project is a climate adaptive solution that benefits a vulnerable community, then BRIC might be the program to pursue. If you identify a project in a community or neighborhood with high NFIP participation and high rates of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties, then FMA might be the best bet, especially in light of the influx of funding that program will receive this year. If your project doesn't quite meet the national competitive objectives, but is still a good mitigation project that reduces hazard risk to people, structures, or critical infrastructure, then look to see if your state has open hazard mitigation grant program funding. You can also reach out to your legislative affairs office to leverage your congressional representatives and potentially start the process of requesting an appropriation through PDM, through pre-disaster mitigation. Note of the 68 projects that were selected for PDM in fiscal year 22, none were over $10 million, just indicating that these are typically smaller projects. New York City Emergency Management has developed a technical assistance program to help city agencies do exactly what we've been talking about. Leverage the available funding opportunities to find the best fit to get mitigation and resiliency work funded in the city. Our next speaker, Heather Reuter, will talk about how EM and the city has implemented this strategy. I'll now turn it over to Heather.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. So again, Heather Reuter from New York City Emergency Management. Just to kind of tie the past speakers, I oversee the city's hazard mitigation plan. So that comprehensive planning process to understand our risk and mitigation strategy against the different hazards. And then because that allows New York City to be eligible for these grants, we also coordinate with our city partners on applying and maximizing funding to come to the city from these funding streams. So as discussed, there's a lot of rules that come with these grants, and they're not the easiest to navigate. There was a lot of funding available to New York City after Sandy from the post-disaster HMGP grant, and that's when we learned that there's a lot of technical assistance that is needed in navigating these funds. The exciting part about BRIC and FMA and that program launching in FY20 is now we can anticipate every year a steady stream of funds that come in and get announced in the fall. So in 2020, we decided to really focus on the technical assistance formal process. And this is just a case study of how we did FY20, but this is representative of other grants that have come up like BRIC 21 and the COVID HMGP funds that were discussed. So the main thing I want to highlight is we started early. Even though we knew that the NOFO was coming out in the fall, we started months in advance just to start soliciting interest from all of our partners. It's not very resource intensive to do that. It was really just going big, saying who's interested, tell us your ideas, looking at our mitigation plan, capital plans, resiliency and climate change work. We started with 60 interested partners. So from there through, and 2020 obviously was an odd year, but through the spring, we were able to whittle down that list. So when we started with the ideas of 60, we started to realize we went down to 20 that dropped to say, okay, we think we have projects that there's more meat on the bones, that there's a solution, an understood problem, and might complement the requirements of this funding. So then we go into consultations and deep diving, starting to collect data for the benefit cost analysis, which is a much more data collected and resource intensive part of these grants. So by the time the grant was announced in September, we have gone from 60 and then we were down to 11 projects that were able to submit letters of interest to the state. And then it's a dash. The last few months, once that grant round's announced, you're really putting a lot of time, a lot of resources into going through all the accumulated information and completing that sub-application. So by the end of 2020, when we had to get our final apps to the state, we were down to 8. So we were able to submit 8 sub-applications because BRIC is around the community resiliency lens. We did try to also be really creative. So we were excited to have focus on heat mitigation, which we had never done in more traditional grants as well. And we'll talk about that as with our next speaker. And while we submitted in December 2020, it's been at the end of last year into this year that we're getting the awards. And so we're excited. 3 out of 8 were selected for funding. So I'll move to the next slide. So what I would just recommend for city partners on the phone, some of the things that we've learned through this process, I think there's generally a challenge in having projects ready to go off the shelf that complement these grants. Really you go from a planning process or planning effort where you have kind of high level ideas, but having enough content to really understand the problem, what the technical solution is, and that it's cost effective. Is a lot of work to get to that. So just being aware that that's something that has to really be fleshed out, and it takes just time to do that. I would say really focusing as part of these grants, there is planning and feasibility funding. The capability and capacity building grant in BRIC does fund that. And so really focusing on, if you don't have a lot of kind of shovel ready resiliency projects, then looking at these feasibility funds to do that, and making sure that when you do that step, that you're also thinking about how do you do the feasibility so it's ready to be submitted for project grant and grant money. And that means doing a VCA when you're doing the feasibility, thinking about the environmental review pieces as well. The other thing we've learned, again, I think I've said this, with the timeline and resource constraints. So if you're waiting until the NOFO, you're behind the ball. And so There's a lot of technical awareness and getting everyone to understand these rules. Agencies have a limited bandwidth to learn new funding streams. So I would say really the big thing is looking at year-round technical assistance, thinking about this as a year-long process and something you can do throughout different grant rounds. One thing that's exciting with BRIC is there is eligible management costs. So 5% of the project can be given to the sub-applicant, the local us, to help do the grant management. And so if awarded, you also have some funding to help you continue to make sure you're doing this in a compliant way. And then last, even I would say just really understanding that you go through this process, I said I started with 60, we ended at 8, but not all the project ideas complement all funding streams, but there's a lot of value in the process alone. So while those 60 projects or ideas we started with whittled down, use that process to really push through the scoping with agencies, because that really sets them up to maybe find other funding that's more complementary to that project. So for us, not all of our projects were selected or made it to submission, but now they've been able to find other funding opportunities, and that's because this process pushed them to really scope out the projects in a really strong way. And you're also building this library of projects, and the great thing with the pre-disaster grants is that we can inspect them every year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Neg, from New York City Department of Transportation.
Thank you, Heather. Hi, everybody. I'm Neg LeCoux, New York City Department of Transportation, Resiliency Planning and Management. As an agency, we typically focus on infrastructure improvements associated with public space. This includes not only streets and sidewalks, but plazas, bike lanes, other pedestrian corridors that are suited for pedestrian walkers. New York City DOT is the largest municipal street management agency of its type in the country. And in our resiliency unit, we not only focus on the risks associated with sea level rise and increased precipitation rates, but we're also shifting our attention to extreme heat, which is recognized in the FEMA, New York State, and New York City hazard mitigation plans. Addressing increasing temperatures is especially important since streets play a unique role in New Yorkers' lives. They serve both as a place where people can be outdoors and also as transportation corridors that continuously allow passage between different locations. Essentially, we do a lot of walking here. That brings us to cool corridors. Along with Seattle, we were the first ever heat mitigation proposal funded by FEMA BRIC to develop design guidelines and a BCA methodology for heat resiliency within our right-of-way. Our strategy was to build off of existing studies that have been done by our New York City sister agencies, and to create a program that draws directly from the research they've conducted. Some of the scope is associated with creating a toolkit of potential interventions, conceptual plans for the application of various New York City street typologies, whether it's permanent or temporary elements. We're still looking to focus on strong nature-based solutions. Additionally, to the various types of streets that are within New York, there's different types of neighborhoods that are unique with distinct street grids, densities, land uses, and community needs. Within our grant, we focused on implementing a pilot program for 3 archetypically different neighborhoods within high vulnerability locations that are based on actual local examples. And lastly, I'll just touch really quickly on the benefit cost methodology that we incorporated as part of the application. We wanted to explore and identify and refine the analytical tools and performance metrics necessary to properly assess the potential interventions. And that includes a sound benefit cost methodology. We didn't want to recreate the wheel. We wanted to essentially stay within the consistency of the BCA methodologies that are used by FEMA. Lastly, I'll just say our application was written so that the cool corridor typologies developed in this study would be able to provide a clear methodology to expand a cool corridors type program to other neighborhoods and cities. And to that point, I will kick it back to Adam.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And it's really exciting to see the groundbreaking work that New York is doing on this, as well as many other cities of looking at heat, which does kill more people a year than all other natural hazards combined. So a real risk we're facing. There are a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm working through those now. Wanted to start with one, Vanessa, for you. You made the point that the programs and the application should be able to show an increased level of protection for the infrastructure that's built and funded. Could you give a little bit more background? And I think Neg touched on that a little bit as well, talking about the BCA of what cities should be thinking about and how they demonstrate that increased level of protection.
Yeah, great question. So typically we start with having cities or any sub-applicant really establish what the current existing condition is. So flooding is easy to think about, right? Maybe, there's no flood protection in place, or maybe there's flood protection up to the 10-year flood event. For example, the increased level of protection that you would be demonstrating is how are you further protecting those people, those structures, or that infrastructure? That may be by increasing, the flood protective measures around that structure to the 100-year flood elevation. And what we would expect to see in your application are, standard engineering practices, feasibility studies that show that the work that will be done through your project is increasing the protection or reducing the hazard risk to the people or structures in the project benefiting area.
Thank you so much. So we have a question, Tamara Lindsay from, wondering if you would be willing to come on camera to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to know if this type of funding was available for cities looking to manage financial stability issues. So either preparing folks to weather a disaster or post-disaster handling some of the financial issues that come up.
Yeah, so there are a couple of different ways to look at the financial stability and financial resiliency aspect, and it's a really great question. Traditional mitigation programs have focused on the direct hazard and have kind of let the impact fall more toward the traditional public assistance, individual assistance type programs. But we've started to see a change over the course of the pandemic. And I think the most important change there was the advent with the American Rescue Plan of the state and local fiscal recovery funds program, because the SLFRF program was such a novel program for cities, so much flexibility to address not just current pandemic concerns, but also building future resiliency. And cities were allowed to build future financial resiliency. There are eligibilities for capacity building, for administrative building, for staffing, for any number of different, addressing longstanding inequities throughout disadvantaged communities and communities that were impacted disproportionately by the pandemic, but who would also be impacted disproportionately by other disasters, and then building infrastructure that would specifically benefit portions of communities that are least likely to be able to respond in future disasters. There's often that case where you have, because of longstanding economic pressures, you have individuals who are least likely to be in a financial position to recover from a disaster, who are most likely to be faced with a disaster, right? So SLFRF gives cities a chance to really look at that in a different way that maybe some of these traditional mitigation programs don't. But then there's another way of looking as well, and that's to look outside of the traditional grant programs and look at mitigation in the context of community redevelopment and through an economic development lens. There are lots of actions that cities can take privately or through braiding of a number of various funding sources that can really impact community redevelopment by applying a resiliency lens toward those redevelopment and development projects. The best example is, every state has some sort of authorizing statute allowing some sort of tax increment financing. Similarly, nearly every state has a statute authorizing some sort of urban renewal. In both of those cases, the trigger to allow the utilization of those economic development tools is generally some sort of blighted condition. Well, exposure to natural hazard, a lot of times flooding, but a lot of times any sort of natural hazard, often is a statutory trigger for these economic development tools. So incorporating resilience into these development and redevelopment projects is a great way to build long-term financial resilience for the community. And creatively, you can braid mitigation funding sources into these projects. It just has to be done from the beginning with an integrated planning process.
That's a perfect advice. And I think what we're going to get a little bit of that as well is the fund mapping exercise and thinking about how to stack these different funding sources together. I want to go to Jen Croft, who had a question as well, but also recognize Dave Gatton, who's joined our call from the U.S. Conference of Mayors. As Rose said, they've been a partner in this work for us from the beginning. Jen, are you able to come online?
Yeah, thank you. So my main question, I understand that a lot of this is focused on resilience and less so maybe on mitigation. But do you think any of the funds that have been mentioned would be suitable for energy efficiency measures? We know DC is now kind of facing the building energy performance standards, and we have about 300 buildings to bring into compliance. And we're looking for federal grant opportunities to support those efforts.
Hi, Jen, thanks for the question. So there is a separate program under IIJA. It's called the Building Codes Implementation for Efficiency and Resilience. This program actually does fund precisely what you just mentioned, along with updates of codes. So for cities that actually need to take a hard look and better understand what their code should be like, the technical process is a fundable activity. But for those cities who need to bring buildings into compliance, there are monies available for that as well. So that seems right in line with what DC would be interested in. I also think there's a potential connection to some of the programs we've already talked about. So I think, Vanessa, are you familiar with, I think, the mitigation piece?
Yeah. I mean, building code, to Harrison's point, right? So building code enforcement or updating your building codes that they're kind of in line with more recent or current code regulations is an eligible activity under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, as well as the BRIC program. You just have to, so those funds that are used for that type of activity are kind of navigated by the state. The priorities are set by the state. And so if you're thinking about these types of programs, and I don't know, I don't know if this would apply to DC, but, typically what we have cities do is reach out to their state hazard mitigation officer to see if the type of work, if they're funding code enforcement. Some states choose to use those funds for other resources or other types of projects. So really kind of reaching out to your state hazard mitigation officer to have a better idea of what their funding priorities are and if they're willing to fund those code enforcement projects.
Gotcha. And Harrison is very familiar with DC government. Good to see you and all that. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Just one question. Harrison, you said IIJA. And then you mentioned a grant. Was it the hazard mitigation or BRIC program that you're speaking about?
So separate from those programs, there actually is a specific program that's about building codes. So we certainly should, get you that information. This is a separate program that's coming online. There's a lot of situations where there's multiple ways to approach, a priority, multiple programs that might come into play, and so this is definitely one I think DC would want to look at.
And Jen, we can follow up with you in a follow-up email with that specific information.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Perfect. And one other question that came in was actually for Heather. And you touched on some of these best practices as you were going through your last slide. But from the process you've looked at, how would you recommend or suggest a city that may have less capacity and not a full-fledged OEM that works through this approach the same type of process? And are there principles that you would suggest cities follow?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly looking at who's in charge of your hazard mitigation plan. Every jurisdiction is required to have one. So there is a lead in a jurisdiction that presumably has worked on this and has at least the starting point of knowing who the point of contacts are at agencies, as well as the initial list of projects. Also, you can reach out to your state hazard mitigation office to see if they're providing any technical assistance for localities. They might be a great resource as well. And I think FEMA's really been pushing forward with offering a lot of webinars too. So there's a lot of resources also available to learn from FEMA as well. And they even have office hours to ask questions. So I think there's kind of different scales of where you can have more direct communication, even if it's just an agency that wants to pursue the grant directly, if you don't have a local there to coordinate.
Thank you. And I'll pass it back to Haggerty for the next section of this. And I'll just remind folks, as Harrison mentioned, there's a very rich appendix that goes into a lot of detail about how you should approach hazard mitigation planning, some of the other resources that you're likely to have within your government already that can be leveraged to those planning processes. You'll get that when this gets sent out. If you have follow-up questions on that, please let us know, and we're happy to schedule additional time to go through that.
All right, could we have the next slide, please? So we've talked a little bit about hazard mitigation planning, and then we've talked about the traditional FEMA hazard mitigation programs. Now is the opportunity, and this is a great opportunity coming off of that last question, to talk about some of the new and emerging funding sources for mitigation and resilience building. We're talking about largely programs that have come out since the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to look at the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery fund that was contained in the American Rescue Plan. We already talked a little bit about that. Then we're going to talk about a number of programs that were either launched or enhanced or funded through the IIJA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or just the Infrastructure Bill. And we'll also touch just a little bit about community development block grant, particularly CDBG-DR disaster funding. Next slide, Kenna. So let's talk just a moment about ARPA and CSLFRF. I mentioned a few minutes ago when I was answering that question that CSLFRF changed the paradigm for mitigation, and that wasn't necessarily the highlight when ARPA was first passed, and the idea that state, local, tribal, and territorial governments were going to have $350 billion to spend on a variety of COVID response and infrastructure. But as the program guidance has evolved and we've moved from the interim final rule to the final rule, and we've seen how some fund planning has gone on at the state and local level, it's become very apparent that yes, SLFRF was very important for pandemic response, but communities are really seizing the opportunity to use these funds in a forward-looking manner. And I want to highlight two particular possible uses of SLFRF funding that apply directly to mitigation and resilience. The first has to do with stormwater. One of the eligibilities that was called out in the authorizing legislation in the American Rescue Plan Act was the ability to invest in infrastructure necessary to move a community forward. The infrastructure investment was limited by statute to water, sewer, and broadband. But in the implementation, the idea of water, sewer, and broadband was further clarified, and the water eligibility was expanded. The water and wastewater eligibilities were expanded to include any projects that were eligible for Clean Water State Revolving Fund or Drinking Water State Revolving Fund loans. So that eligibility in and of itself allowed a number of comprehensive stormwater management projects to be involved. Now, the guidance was very clear to say we're not including straight flood risk remediation. However, integrated stormwater management projects that included quantity as well as quality were certainly eligible because they were Clean Water State Revolving Fund eligible. This eligibility got increased significantly when the final rule was issued, because eligibility for stormwater system development, maintenance, and replacement was added, specific to culverts and other pieces of hard stormwater infrastructure. So with that came the ability to remediate localized drainage problems, street flooding, and a number of other different local hazards. These are huge eligibilities because there's anytime, especially a community in a flood-prone area, can have money that's very flexible, that has very few strings attached, and a very important point here, can be used for projects that wouldn't necessarily meet a BCA requirement. This is huge. So the second important part of the SLFRF mitigation picture is that when the final rule was issued, a determination was made by the United States Treasury that any funds that were available to the recipient under the eligibility of provision of government services, meaning funds that were available to offset revenue loss that was created by the pandemic, either calculated revenue loss or revenue loss up to the $10 million standard allowance that was allowed by the final rule, would be available as non-federal match for federal grant programs, with very few exceptions, Medicaid and CHIP. But this is huge. That means that a small amount of funding can be leveraged as non-federal match and bring back a 75% rate of return on a FEMA grant or an 80% rate of return on a USDOT grant. That's very important to know. And as communities are now receiving their second tranche of SLFRF funding, are working on reviewing what they did in their first year, reprogramming, rebudgeting funding within their SLFRF allocation, the idea of reserving some revenue loss funds for non-federal match for grant programs should be at the top of every recipient's list. Next slide. So with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a number of programs have become a number of programs, and we're not talking a small number, we're talking about hundreds of programs, have been either created or have been substantially increased or enhanced or funded. These programs are individual in nature. There's not a centralized administration in the way that the American Rescue Plan Act was head central administration. They're individual programs with individual agencies, individual applications, individual funding progression. And accordingly, the rules and applications and notices of funding opportunities are just trickling through. One of these particular programs that is very exciting is the PROTECT program. PROTECT is a coastal resiliency program focused on transportation, and it's an $8.7 billion program in total. It supports planning and actual infrastructure construction, hardening of and relocation of coastal infrastructure, general resilience improvements for coastal communities, work on evacuation routes. There's a formula funding component that will proceed through states, and then there are competitive grants for individual planning efforts and projects. So PROTECT will give eligible recipients new ways to look at coastal mitigation, but it requires detailed planning that maybe hasn't been engaged in before to access federal funding. It really requires a movement toward the type of comprehensive resiliency planning that we were talking about earlier in the presentation. And like many of these new federal programs, there's an equity lens that goes with it. Next slide. So wanted to touch on a couple of other mitigation and resilience programs. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund is an existing program, but it was significantly recapitalized in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And not only was it recapitalized, but along with the additional money flowing to states, there was a requirement that the proceeds of this money be used not just for low interest loans, but for forgivable loans and grants. The eligibilities for Clean Water State Revolving Fund were maintained, but also were expanded to include projects that could include contaminants of emerging concern or lead pipe replacement, and they largely overlap with Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which was given a similar amount of new capitalization money with the same idea of creating forgivable loans and new grants. Again, these will be state administered, and they're still very early in the process of developing rules both at the federal level and then developing program rules at the state level. But this is a tremendous mitigation opportunity that's always been largely overlooked in terms of use for flood risk remediation. Another program funded, not created, but funded by the IIJA is the STORM Act. It's the IIJA provided $500 million for the creation or the funding of this program, which is a disaster relief revolving loan program to be administered by each state, much in the same way the Clean Water and Drinking Water revolving funds are. We've seen some states start to pass authorizing legislation that will allow the state to create and administer these programs, but we're still talking about the infancy of this program. This will be coming likely later this fall. And then it's also worth mentioning Community Development Block Grant, CDBG DR. A couple of important things to know. All of the 2020 and 2021 disaster funds related to CDBG DR are allocated. Most went to state governments, total of about $5 billion. CDBG DR is normally a 15% of all unmet needs for mitigation after a disaster, but it's specific to the congressional action. So you have to be in the designated area in order to access these funds. You need to work with your state CDBG agency, generally a Department of Commerce, or Department of Housing in order to access this funding, or to know whether this funding is available to you in your area. Let's see, next slide. Just want to briefly highlight some other mitigation and resilience programs in the IIJA. As I said before, there are literally hundreds of programs within the IIJA. However, we've pulled out a couple of programs as a survey to show the breadth and the depth of these types of programs. These programs range everywhere from a community wildlife defense grant, wildfire defense grant to deal with wildfire risk that's becoming an increasing hazard, not just in Western states, but all over the country. Habitat restoration programs, emergency preparedness grants. The Healthy Streets program is a great program. Little note about the Healthy Streets program: it was not included in the White House guidebook about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So we've provided a good deal of information about that in the supplemental materials for this webinar. And coastal zone management is a great program for coastal communities to look at dealing with, the hurricane hazards. Just a great set of example programs to show the breadth and depth of the IIJA. But the most important takeaway here is that the IIJA has so many programs that are individual in nature, and it really brings us to the challenge that local cities face in terms of knowing about, accessing, and then managing these various funding streams. Next slide. So that brings us, after that brief overview, it brings us to an actual fund mapping exercise. What I want to do is I want to introduce Mitigation Town. Mitigation Town is a coastal community, a small city. Mitigation Town has your average city's resources, and Mitigation Town wants to move toward building greater community resilience. As we're going to see, the main hazard that Mitigation Town faces is hurricane damage. So the city leaders in Mitigation Town sat down and they started to ask themselves, what can we do in terms of moving forward? We see news articles, we see emails from mailing lists, we understand that there's a lot of funding out there, but we don't know where to go. So what Mitigation Town is going to engage in a fund mapping exercise. Fund mapping builds on rather than substitutes for mitigation and resilience planning. The planning that goes in, the planning that's been done is an input into the fund mapping process and will largely dictate how useful the process is. When the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was released, cities suddenly were faced with hundreds of new programs, modified programs over a vast number of topical areas. These were cities who were already dealing with finishing expending their CRF money, spending their SLFRF money, spending ERAP money. So there's a lot of federal funding overload going on, and that doesn't even get into cities that have faced disasters and maybe dealing with public assistance, maybe dealing with hazard mitigation grants. But fund mapping is a data-driven process. It's the time to take the ideas about what needs to be done to move the community forward from a resilience point of view, and then actually identify input. This is a process much like the one Heather explained when she was talking about what she's developed in New York City, broadening out, looking at hazards, looking at potential projects, and looking at funding sources and matching together to be ready for the future. Next slide. So like I said, Mitigation Town's primary risk is hurricane. Over the course of the process, the leadership of Mitigation Town met with stakeholders, met with staff, met with engineers, met with their hazard mitigation consultants, and distilled down to 3 primary risks they were facing that needed to be addressed. One was street flooding, one was wind damage to buildings, particularly a number of public buildings, and one was beach erosion and habitat loss, particularly dune damage, as well as just standard beach erosion. So they went through and they started looking at potential funding sources, evaluated the FEMA programs, evaluated SLFRF, evaluated whether HMGP was available in the area, whether there was an open disaster for HMGP, and then started to look at all of the new programs that were contained in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and landed on a number of possible programs. For street flooding, this was nuisance flooding. There weren't a lot of structures involved, so FMA wasn't really realistic. There could have been a possibility for a large BRIC project in the area, but unfortunately, the Mitigation Town maybe is located in a state that doesn't have strong building codes. Mitigation Town, for whatever reason, doesn't necessarily have the strongest building codes, and that took BRIC off the table. And so looking to the IIJA, they settled on protect. Coastal community needing to fix and harden transportation infrastructure. Street flooding was a perfect match to protect. For building wind damage, again, we're talking about projects that could have the potential for that could be difficult to meet under some of the traditional guidelines, but we happen to know that under some of the FEMA guidelines, there are some BCA values that are assumed for certain wind mitigation projects, and they were able to use one of the packages of values, and they are looking at HMGP in that case. And there was an open HMGP disaster that they could submit a sub-application for. Beach erosion and habitat loss fit perfectly into an IIJA program, the Coastal Zone Management Program. So with that, they developed a project listing and started to develop cost estimates where there were open application periods. They started to move forward with the process of submitting sub-applications, and where there were not open applications yet, there's no NOFO for protect. They have an application that's ready to go on the shelf and are ready to submit at the time the NOFO comes out. So with that, I believe we're ready to move toward a more general question and answer. So I'll throw the presentation back to Adam.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tom. And that kind of mapping exercise is a great place to start launching off as we get into the questions, because it is a dizzying array of federal programs that are out there, and knowing which ones to pick and how to navigate and how to stack them together is always a challenge. A couple questions coming in from the chat, and I'd encourage folks to please throw them in to the chat. In the event that we're unable to get to all of them, given the number that are coming in, we do follow-up. So even if we can't answer your question on today's program, we will follow up to make sure you do get an answer. But want to start with Sam in one of my favorite cities in the country, in Detroit, who had a question about protecting coastal protection.
Thanks. I can ask my question. So really for us, we have a flooding issue from rising river levels and Great Lakes levels. And as a result of that, we've had one of one of our neighborhoods designated as a FEMA floodplain. And we've been working with the U.S. Army Corps on floodplain mitigation, but we're left with the multi-million-dollar question of how do we fund it, or what programs might be out there to help remove the community from the floodplain and protect infrastructure from overland river flooding. My question is can Protect be used for that type of coastal flooding, or is it intended only for like oceanic flooding, like resulting from hurricanes?
So part of the caveat I tried to explain was that a lot of these programs haven't gone through rulemaking or development of applications yet. And we haven't seen a NOFO on Protect. So there are a couple of details that aren't clear yet. One of them is exactly how extensive Protect will be allowed for riverine flooding. And the bigger question is whether it'll be allowable for the Great Lakes. It seems from the guidance in the statute, there's no reason to believe it wouldn't be allowable for Great Lakes projects, because in general, mitigation funding tends to consider Great Lakes to be coastal areas for those funding purposes. But we're just going to have to wait and see what happens when the program rules are actually released, in terms of whether those projects would be eligible as on the competitive grant side, and then also whether those Great Lakes states are given any of the formula set aside. And we don't know how that formula money is going to be broken down quite yet. I will say the IIJA has a couple of Great Lakes specific programs in it. And in addition to the formula and competitive funding grant programs that are in the IIJA, there are a number of federal agency direct funding programs. The Corps is getting an immense amount of money for its own mitigation and risk reduction work. And it's not just limited to core projects, dams and whatnot. It's for largely targeted for the Corps to be able to go out and fund work in communities. So there should be increased opportunities for the Corps, NRCS, various federal agencies to engage in mitigation and resilience activities with communities, because this funding is going to exist on that level.
And
Thanks,
Tom,
that's helpful.
Sorry. Tom, just one follow-up on that. Would this be an opportunity, or do you think it makes sense for cities that maybe in the Great Lakes area or near rivers to be talking to their Congress people or their states or others to try to influence that rulemaking?
Certainly couldn't hurt. Protect is going to be an interesting program, and there are lots of ways that program could evolve. But I think particularly on the Great Lakes side, it would be, in my opinion, a mistake to exclude the Great Lakes communities from the coastal formula funding.
Perfect. And related to those questions around Protect and eligibility, and it may be that we don't have an answer yet given the programs are being formed. Lucy, are you able to come on from Seattle?
Sure, I can come on. So similar question. If you don't have the answer, that's okay. But we do find that many of FEMA programs in particular are often developed with hurricanes in mind, which is understandable. So, but wondering from our perspective in the Pacific Northwest, if there's anything in either the Protect or the coastal zone management that would make them ineligible for, say, tsunami related flooding as opposed to hurricane flooding.
No, I think that both of those programs, as well as a number of the other coastal programs, are specifically not hazard specific. I think that particularly Protect would be very useful for tsunami resilience, because it specifically calls out evacuation routes and hardening of coastal infrastructure focuses on the transportation side, but I think Protect would be a great program for tsunami risk.
Thank you.
Excellent. And Bianca, are you available to come online? You have a great question on resilience hubs, which I know a number of cities around the country are looking at how to design and fund these.
I'm on mute. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah, 2022, and we're still dealing with that. Okay. Yeah, so we've been looking at with extreme heat. We're dealing with the largest wildfire in our state history right now, and then monsoon seasons are fast approaching. So the trifecta is on its way here. Resiliency hubs is something of interest as far as offering them up or standing them up in a number of our communities, but it's difficult to figure out how to create one, right? How to create multiple around there are best practices, there's, recommendations. When I reached out to FEMA, they didn't really have much as far as how to fund it directly. Neither does Department of Energy, which of course also has a number of funding opportunities for this type of work. And so I was just wondering if, do you think the federal government, because of the interests around the country, will they perhaps pull together something that can actually design this type of a hub, or, our states or local communities basically have to resort to, patchwork of funding with BRIC or HMA or any of these other opportunities? Just what is your, as experts, what do you see as possibilities?
Hi, Bianca. I'm glad Heather's on, because actually in fiscal year 21, FEMA, one of the projects funded in New York City was a project scoping activity for resiliency hubs. And, what we're seeing is, funding of maybe microgrids for critical facilities that function as, either, temporary shelters or other forms of resiliency hubs, spaces to, for communities to use during extreme heat days, maybe if there's loss of power throughout the neighborhood. But these activities are funded via project scoping. We haven't had any activities, funding direct implementation, but we are seeing FEMA interested in these types of projects. I'll turn it over to Heather to give us more details on the one that was recently funded.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I feel like resiliency hubs is coming up in so many conversations, and especially in the post-COVID environment, I think it really resonated. So we, our New York City Housing Authority did submit for a BRIC scoping grant for identifying using their spaces as resiliency hubs. A lot of it has to do with the multi-hazard approach, and I think you kind of pick up benefits and then they accumulate when you look at all the different hazards that might trigger that need. I guess the other thing I'll say in my take, that combined with the other project we heard from DOT on pool corridors, I find with these grants, if they don't explicitly say no, then push and let them, force them to say no. So push the innovation and let them see what they come back with. And if they say no, then ask why as well. And so that's the approach. And luckily we've been able to get the heat mitigation and now the resilience hubs approved these past years.
So are the scoping grants you're talking about, are those through FEMA, or where are those? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a ceiling that each state gets towards those grants, or at least that's what the rules have been the last 2 years. But it was BRIC, they're called CNCB grants, which are scoping planning grants. And I would just say with the, as I said earlier, if you're gonna look for these, try to think about the planning money is great, but then the next step is you want money for implementation. So make sure you think about how to incorporate BCA or have the scoping give you a deliverable that makes it easy to apply for another grant for implementation. And BCA is the benefit cost analysis is the main one that tends to be the unique deliverable that you would need that you wouldn't normally use or think about.
Yeah, what I would add, Bianca, is to reach out to your state. Because with that tranche of funding that Heather's talking about, the capacity and capability building, that's a state allocation. And so states are very deliberate with how they use that funding. And so especially for project scoping activities, you sort of have to engage them and get them excited about your project so that they will prioritize it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And Vanessa and Harrison and Tom, as a follow-up to that, and Heather as well, do you have advice for cities that may traditionally not have worked with their state or may not work with their state on a lot of issues and sometimes have the same priorities, on how to get them excited, how to frame these issues up? Are there some best practices that you think that people should look at as they're thinking about these large tranches of money?
Yeah, I mean, understanding who to go to at the state. Sometimes with the states that we've worked with in the past, states will often put out webinars when a funding opportunity is coming online. And so, becoming familiar with what those state resources are, getting on state emailing lists, as simple as that, so that you can participate in those webinars, and also finding a direct contact with your state, typically the emergency management office, right? Finding a direct resource there so that you can engage them directly is the best avenue. And then, you can start having these technical assistance calls with them. They can sort of guide you on, sometimes they'll guide you on what funding source is best suitable for your project. So, again, what I recommend is paying attention to your state resources, seeing if they have any webinars coming up, getting a name that you can email or call just to start that connection.
I agree with all that. I would also add, having the name. If you also sometimes just building partnerships with your neighbors. So you might want to look and see who else has been awarded in the state. You can go on FEMA's website, see where their awards went for these last 2 years, and reach out to your neighbors and find out who put their application together and who they work with, and learn from them as well.
And just to add, get to know your state hazard mitigation officer, get to know your state NFIP coordinator, get to know, attend the conferences. This is a networking exercise as much as anything. And then as you build that relationship, make sure your SHMO knows that you have projects ready to go, because there's going to come a time where your SHMO is facing a deadline and a project doesn't meet a BCA, or has to, a city backs out at the last minute, and that SHMO is under a lot of pressure to make sure that an entire HMGP allocation gets filled. If you have a project that's ready to go, you might get the phone call on that.
For those of you from New York, SHMO is not Yiddish. It's the state mitigation officer. So Nicole, you had a great question, I think, built on some of that, asking about technical planning and the financial assistance for that. Are you in a place now where you could come online to ask that?
Yeah, I can try. Thank you. I was just hoping someone could remind us of which programs do offer the planning assistance, or for either, I heard scoping through BRIC is one. There was also reference to technical assistance. Just any of those resources to help us get set up to use the infrastructure funds. Thank you.
Yeah, so for pre-application work, developing your designing your project, getting all the materials you need, the data collection you need for benefit cost analysis, doing feasibility studies, all of that kind of pre-project planning. You can use the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. There's advanced assistance under Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Again, you do need state involvement. Some states don't really take advantage of advanced assistance, so making that connection again is very important. Under BRIC, as you mentioned, the project scoping funding, also a state allocation. There is funding under all of the FEMA programs for planning related activities. So that includes the BRIC program and the HMGP. And then, PDM is sort of again, like I said, it's through direct congressional appropriations, but if you have an idea of doing an advanced assistance or a project scoping activity, you would have to engage your congressional, your legislative affairs office, for example, to get that funding. But that's really where we see the most, funding is the HMGP advanced assistance to do that work, that kind of that pre-implementation work.
And then for the final question, maybe Harrison, I know we talked about this in advance as we're preparing for this, and a question came through the chat, just helping to align cities' expectations on how long it takes to get the funding, and given the emergencies they're trying to respond to, are these things that can fund immediate needs, or is it more of the medium-term, longer-term projects?
I think it's interesting. So, the idea that you would, be able to kind of move from the planning to the implementation phase of a project, a typical mitigation project, in short order, not likely. These are usually projects that take a couple of years to complete, at least in my experience. That having been said, what's interesting is there's always kind of a number of projects that are probably already underway, and so adding a new project to an area to make it even reduce risk even more is always kind of a significant additional thing to do. So you think about how we see these programs and projects, we think about them as the funding streams and whatnot. But what the public sees is that their neighborhood's getting safer, and that things are improving or conditions are improving. So adding in these programs, even in the medium term, allows you to talk about things you're doing right now and then what you'll be doing next. And it becomes a cohesive sort of presentation to communities.
Thank you so much. And with that, I want to thank all of our panelists today, and particularly give a shout out to my former colleagues and friends in New York City, and pass it back to Rose to wrap us up.
Great, thank you so much, Adam. And so the recording of this discussion and all of the slides are going to be posted on our E311 website that my colleague Jamie Lavin put into the chat for those of you who are not already familiar with it. Please continue to pose additional questions also on that E311 website as you continue with your planning. We are available and our experts are available to continue to answer your questions throughout the week and throughout the next couple of months. In addition, Jamie posted the site for the upcoming exciting local infrastructure hub. There's going to be a suite of services that are provided pertaining to the IIJA funding that will be very dynamic. So look for that as well. And that site is there in the chat. And our next workshop will be held on June 30th, and it will be on a topic relating to the use of ARPA funds for boosting municipal hiring and capacity. And so we hope to see you there for that, and we'll send out emails and invitations for that in the next couple of days. So thank you so much, and best of luck to everybody, and we will be with you soon. Thank you.